My name is Vivian Lang. I am 31 years old and 5 years of my life vanished while I was working overseas without me realizing it. When I left the United States, I thought I was just taking a dream assignment. I packed light, promised my family I would be back when the contract ended, and told my sister she could use my empty bedroom until I returned. I did not give her my permission to become me. 5 years later, I stepped out of a rideshare in a quiet suburb outside New Orleans, suitcase in hand, heart pounding harder than the jet lag could explain. The house in front of me was supposed to be just an address on paper, a mailing point I kept for practical reasons. Instead, it looked lived in, settled, comfortable, like someone had been building a whole future there. I walked up the path, key in my palm, still telling myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe my parents were inside. Maybe my sister was just staying here short term. Maybe the bank alerts I had been brushing off for months were nothing. The door opened before I could knock. A man I had never seen smiled at me like he had been waiting all day. He said one thing, in a tone that made my stomach drop. Welcome home. In that second, I understood that the life attached to my name in this city did not belong to me at all. Before I tell you what he said, and what happened after I walked out, tell me, what time is it for you right now, and where are you watching from? I'm curious to see how far this story will travel. That night, in a cheap motel off the highway, I finally let my hands shake. The room was quiet except for the air conditioner rattling in the wall and the dull traffic noise bleeding through the door. I set my suitcase in the corner, opened my laptop on the small desk, and stared at the login screen for a long time. I had spent years working in places where the internet cut out without warning, where electricity was a luxury, where entire communities measured time in seasons instead of deadlines. Somehow, none of that had made me as nervous as the thought of checking what America had been doing in my name. I signed into my email, then my banking app, then the credit monitoring account I barely ever looked at. My legal name, Vivian Lang, sat at the top of every page, familiar and suddenly foreign at the same time. The first thing that hit me was the address, a street in a suburb outside New Orleans, the same neighborhood where I had just stood on a stranger's porch. My name, that address, repeated again and again. Utility bills, insurance notices, a local store card I had never applied for, automatic payments I had never set up. 5 years earlier, when I left the country for work, my family had treated it like I was going to the other side of the moon. My mother, Nadine, cried through most of the airport goodbyes. My father, Mark, kept asking practical questions about power of attorney, mail delivery, tax returns. My older sister, Marissa, volunteered to keep an eye on things while I was gone, the way she always did when there was paperwork to organize and someone else's life to manage. At the time, it felt harmless. I signed a few forms, set up mail forwarding to the family home, added Marissa as a contact on certain accounts. I told myself it would make their lives easier. I would be sending money home occasionally, visiting when I could, living out of a backpack in places where the only official address I needed belonged to whatever project compound I slept in. The first year abroad blurred into the second. Connection was spotty, and I got used to checking messages in bursts whenever the signal appeared. A few odd alerts slipped through back then, small things I wiped away with tired explanations. A statement I didn't recognize, addressed to me but mailed to a Louisiana P.O. box I had never requested. A brief note from a bank representative asking to confirm a change of address I didn't remember approving. When I asked Marissa about it over a rushed call, she laughed it off and said she was just consolidating mail so nothing important went missing. I let it go. I was exhausted, jet-lagged most of the time, and grateful someone back home was willing to handle the boring parts of my life. In the motel room, with a stable connection and no one else to blame, I watched the pattern fill my screen. What had started as mail forwarding had slowly become something else. Somewhere in the third year, my official address shifted from the family home to that suburb outside New Orleans. A few months later, a new account appeared with my name attached to a property there. After that, a series of utilities, insurance policies, and local services lined up like dominoes. Every entry carried my information, my social security number, my date of birth. My name typed neatly beside charges and balances that had nothing to do with the work I was doing overseas. Under the property entry, a secondary name was listed as a contact. Marissa's first name sat there in clean, professional font, as if she belonged on that line. My chest tightened, but the emotion wasn't confusion anymore. It was recognition. None of this was an accident, and none of it was temporary. This was a life being constructed, detail by detail, with my identity as the foundation. I scrolled back through messages I had skimmed and forgotten. There were notes from my parents mentioning that Marissa was handling things for me, that everyone was proud of how well I seemed to be balancing travel and responsibilities. There were automated emails thanking me for choosing certain services in New Orleans, written in the flat, cheerful language of corporate systems that have no idea when they are being used as weapons. By the time I closed my laptop, the shaking in my hands had stopped. The facts were simple, even if everything around them felt unreal. Someone I trusted had stopped helping and started building an entire existence with my name on every single line. By the next morning, I knew I needed someone who understood how the system worked better than I did. I searched for an attorney who handled identity theft and financial fraud, scrolling through firm websites until one name kept coming up in local reviews. Within an hour, I was sitting in a small conference room facing an attorney named Nina Rhodes. She scanned my driver's license, glanced at my passport, and listened while I explained that a man had greeted me at a house tied to my credit file as if I lived there, even though I had spent the last 5 years on another continent. Nina asked precise questions. How long I had been gone, who in my family had access to my documents, when I first noticed anything unusual in my accounts. I answered, forcing myself to stick to facts instead of drifting into disbelief. When I finished, she sat back, tapped her pen against a legal pad, and told me the part I already suspected but did not want to say out loud. This was not a misunderstanding. It was deliberate. She laid out what needed to happen in simple steps. I would request full reports from the major credit bureaus, not just the summaries on my phone. I would pull every statement tied to the address outside New Orleans. I would write down a timeline of my work assignments abroad, every flight in and out of the country, every stretch with limited access. Nina would help me compare my physical location to each account opened in my name. Then came the part that made my stomach tighten again. For any account that showed clear evidence of fraud, she wanted me ready to sign sworn statements. Once those were in place, she could contact the institutions, flag the accounts, and, if necessary, bring in law enforcement. Her tone stayed steady, but there was no softening what she was suggesting. If the person behind this was who I thought it was, I would be handing my own sister over to a system that did not care about family ties. Nina did not push me to decide in that moment. Instead, she focused on preserving evidence. She told me to stop confronting people verbally and to avoid sending emotional messages that could muddy things later. She suggested I speak with a fraud investigator who worked with banks and insurers, someone she had collaborated with on other cases. His name was Ian Price. I met Ian that afternoon in a different office across town, a low building with a reception area that looked more like an accountant's than anything dramatic. He was quiet and methodical, with the kind of patience that made people keep talking. He walked me through how credit files are built, how addresses link, how one change can ripple through systems until it looks like someone lives an entire life in a place they have never set foot. Together, we went line by line through the accounts connected to my name. Ian pointed out details I never would have noticed, The way registrations clustered around holiday periods when I was hardest to reach. The way some charges were small and regular, clearly designed to blend into routine expenses. Whoever had done this was careful, but not careful enough to hide the timing. By the time I left his office, we had a plan that covered the next 3 weeks. I would keep my distance from my family, staying at the motel and moving quietly. I would gather copies of every document linked to that house, property records, online account profiles, any paperwork I could access without alerting the person who had set them up. Ian would coordinate with Nina so each new discovery fed into a growing file with my name on the front. In the evenings, I sat on the edge of the motel bed with my laptop balanced on my knees, building the timeline Nina had requested. I listed my assignments overseas, when I was on project sites with no reliable signal, when I was in transit, when I briefly passed through the states between deployments. Next to those entries, I marked the openings of accounts in Louisiana, the changes of address, the approvals for services and applications. The gaps lined up with a precision that turned unease into certainty. The more the pattern sharpened, the less room there was for wishful thinking. This was not someone using my name by accident or out of confusion. This was someone who knew exactly when I would be too far away or too busy to notice. Someone who understood my work schedule almost as well as I did. Someone who knew my social security number, my parents' routines, and the way our family handled responsibility. Someone who had grown up under the same roof I did. Later that week, I stopped avoiding my parents. We met at a small coffee shop on the edge of the city, far from the suburb where my name had been living a second life. I arrived early, ordered coffee, and laid printed copies of the key documents on the table. My hands were steady. Shock had hardened into focus. When my parents walked in, they looked more tired than I remembered. They hugged me automatically, then sat and waited. I did not start with accusations. I slid the first page toward them and asked them to look it over. The address at the top was the house in the suburb outside New Orleans. Beneath it were account numbers and billing cycles. I watched their eyes move down the page, then drift to the next one when I added it to the stack. Utility accounts, insurance, a property record tying that address to my legal name, Vivian Lang. I asked when they had first seen that address. I asked when they agreed to let anything be opened using my information. I kept my voice even. I wanted their memory, not their defenses. The explanation came in short pieces. After I left the country, my older sister started coming to them with what sounded like a plan. She told them it would help me keep a stable base in the States while I worked overseas. She said certain projects required a permanent address, that it would look better if I seemed rooted somewhere rather than always moving. She claimed I could not go into detail because of confidentiality rules tied to my work. Normally, my father would have insisted on hearing this from me, but they were already used to delayed calls and patchy email. When messages began arriving that looked like they were from me, using the same phrases my sister had used in person, their doubts faded. They believed they were backing a strategy I had approved. They did not think they were helping her. They thought they were helping me. Listening to them, I could map out the points where caution slipped. Marissa became the person who handled my mail, my tax forms, the small administrative tasks I did not want to manage from another hemisphere. Each new permission sounded reasonable by itself. Change where statements were mailed. Let her sign one form. Let her talk to one bank on my behalf. By the time an entire house existed under my name, they had stopped asking why I never mentioned living there. I asked who had first raised the idea of the house. They both said her name. Saying it out loud in that room shifted the air. Up to that moment, she had been a shadow in the story. Once her name was spoken, the outline sharpened. There was no clerk to blame, no glitch in a system. Only someone who had grown up in the same family and knew exactly how far she could stretch their trust. I told them I had already spoken with an attorney and with a fraud investigator. I did not outline what might come next or what charges could be filed. I only made one thing clear. I would not be treating this as a misunderstanding or a private argument. Their faces tightened. Neither of them tried to talk me out of it. Whatever loyalty they felt toward my sister did not erase the reality on the pages between us. The next step was the man at the door. I went back to the suburb one afternoon when the street was quiet and most driveways were empty. This time, I carried only a thin folder and a phone set to record. I rang the bell and waited. He opened the door with the same familiarity as before and used my name like it belonged in his mouth. His shoulders dropped in relief. I stayed on the porch and watched him, listening for the story he thought we shared. I let him talk. He mentioned bills, routines, neighbors, the way my supposed travel schedule made planning awkward. Each detail matched the accounts that had been opened in my name. His version of my life included information only my family should have known. It sounded like someone had handed him a script and never told him it was fiction. At one point, he mentioned my sister. He used her first name casually, as if she were just a helpful relative. That single detail locked everything into place. She had not kept this to mail and signatures. She had used my identity to build a relationship inside his home. When I left that day, I walked back to my car with more than suspicion. I had documents, timelines, and a witness whose daily life rested on a version of me that had never existed. Back at the motel, the days settled into a routine that felt more like surveillance than recovery. Each morning, I rotated between phone calls and forms. Credit bureaus, utility companies, the county office that maintained property records, every place my name appeared on a screen or a file. I requested full statements, confirmation letters, copies of applications supposedly signed by me. Whenever a clerk sounded hesitant, I used the same line. I had been living overseas and needed to verify that no one had used my identity without consent. It was dull work on the surface, but every new document felt like another brick in a wall I was finally learning how to build for myself. Afternoons belonged to paper. I bought a cheap scanner and turned the motel desk into a command center. I created folders on my laptop for each institution and mirrored them with physical binders, labeling everything in thick black ink. One binder held only items tied to the house in the suburb outside New Orleans. Another tracked the smaller accounts that tried to blend into ordinary expenses. Behind every charge, every service, every neat line of text, I saw the same choice repeated. Someone I trusted had decided my name was easier to live under than her own. Ian checked in regularly, sometimes by email, sometimes in short calls, where his voice stayed calm while mine threatened to catch. He explained how to preserve metadata on scanned documents, how to download statements without altering timestamps, how to log each interaction with a company so that Nina could later point to a clear trail. The process was slow, methodical, and strangely quiet, more like dismantling a carefully wired machine than exposing a single dramatic lie. On the legal side, Nina turned what I sent her into structure. She sorted every account into groups, clearly fraudulent, potentially disputed, and legitimate. For each fraudulent entry, she drafted affidavits for me to review, statements that made my stomach twist even as I knew they were necessary. Signing my name at the bottom of a page declaring that another person had used it without permission felt like stepping outside myself and pointing a finger at my own face. We agreed on one fixed rule. I would not confront my sister in private. When the time came, there would be witnesses who understood what they were seeing, and there would be documents on the table that backed every word I planned to say. No late-night arguments, no emotional scenes in a doorway, nothing she could reshape into a misunderstanding. The 3 weeks filled quickly. I met my parents a few more times in public places, never at their home and never anywhere near the house that carried my name. I let them see parts of the process so they understood this was no longer a family disagreement, but a legal correction. They asked what might happen to their other daughter, whether there was any way to undo what had been done without involving courts. I did not offer comfort, and I did not make promises I could not keep. Instead, I focused on decisions I controlled. Nina and I chose a date when everyone would already be planning to sit at the same table, a holiday dinner, the kind of evening that had always drawn our family back together, no matter how scattered we became during the year. My parents would host. I would attend. My sister would be invited with no warning about what waited for her. In the days leading up to that dinner, I went back to the suburb one last time without stepping past the threshold. I parked down the street and watched the routine unfold from my car. Lights flipped on at predictable hours, deliveries dropped off on the front step. A life I did not recognize continued as if nothing were wrong. I noted the license plates in the driveway, the names on packages, the rhythm of departures and returns. None of it changed what had already been collected. If anything, it confirmed how deeply the fiction had settled into the neighborhood. People waved when cars pulled in. A child from next door steered a bike down the sidewalk and left a backpack on the porch without worrying whether it was safe. The house did not look like the scene of a crime. It looked like every other home on the block, which somehow made the theft feel more complete. By the end of the third week, the binders were full, the digital folders were backed up, and Nina's office had everything she needed to move from preparation to action. All that remained was to put everyone in the same room, lay the documents between us, and see who was still willing to pretend they did not understand what my name had been used for. The night of the dinner arrived before my nerves caught up. My parents hosted in their small house, the same living room where we had once opened presents together. Now the furniture felt closer, the air heavier. They moved around the kitchen in a quiet rhythm, setting the table and checking the oven, careful not to look at the folders stacked at one end. I had brought only what mattered: copies of the property records, utility accounts, insurance policies. A summary Ian had prepared that showed the sequence of applications in my name lined up against the years I had spent overseas. Nina had walked me through each section and made sure I could explain it without looking away from anyone across the table. When the doorbell rang, my chest stayed level. Fear had burned off during the weeks of preparation. What remained was a calm weight. My sister stepped inside first. She carried a covered dish with the ease of someone arriving at a normal family gathering. She hugged our parents, made a comment about traffic, and only then let her eyes settle on me. For a second, her expression flickered. Then she smoothed it over with the same practiced warmth I had heard in messages sent under my name. The man from the house followed her in with a polite nod. He thanked my parents for hosting and set a bottle of sparkling cider on the counter. My mother took the bottle and turned back to the table. We sat down. The meal began with small talk that tasted like cardboard. My parents asked about work. My sister asked about flights. I answered with short, factual sentences. I did not mention the motel or the hours on the phone. The folders at my elbow did not move. It was my father who reached for them. He cleared his throat and placed his hand on the stack, then slid it toward the center of the table. Silverware fell silent. My sister's gaze tracked the movement and stopped when she recognized the county seal at the top of the first page. I did not raise my voice. I picked up the property record and read the heading, my legal name, the address in the suburb outside New Orleans, the date the record showed the house had been tied to me. I laid the page flat, then turned the next one toward them so the overlapping timelines were visible. I described, in plain language, where I had actually been when those documents were signed, which border I was crossing, which project I was stationed on, how far I was from any office in Louisiana. Each statement stayed simple: place, distance, impossibility. When I finished, I let the silence work on the numbers. Across from me, my sister cycled through reactions without finding words that held. First came a thin frown, then her jaw set. Her hands moved off the table, fingers folding tightly in her lap. When I reached the portion of Ian's summary that listed every account opened in my name with the house as the anchor address, she looked straight at me. The recognition in her eyes was clear. So was the calculation. She knew exactly what those pages meant and how much work had gone into collecting them. If there was regret, it vanished before it reached her mouth. I continued through the file: utility accounts, insurance policies, local services that had no reason to exist without someone living in that house under my name. The pattern repeated with the same rhythm. My information, the same address, dates that lined up with the periods when I was gone. Whenever my voice threatened to shake, I focused on reading the details instead of their expressions. My mother held a napkin between both hands, twisting it slowly until the fabric creased. My father stared at the documents with the concentration of someone who had finally accepted that there was no other explanation waiting beneath the one in front of him. The man from the house listened closely. He leaned forward when I turned each page, tracing the lines that connected my name to the life he believed he shared with me. When I mentioned the day I had stood on his porch with a key that no longer fit, his shoulders lowered in quiet understanding. When every page had been laid down, there was nothing else to show. I said, as clearly as I could, that my identity had been used without consent for years, that the records in front of us documented that use, and that I had already started the process of correcting them with legal help. I did not describe it as a misunderstanding. I named it as a choice. The silence that followed was not the pause before another excuse. It was the sound of a story that had run out of places to hide. The weeks after that dinner, the consequences arrived faster than anyone's feelings could adjust. Nina filed the affidavits, notified the companies holding accounts in my name, and sent notices that my identity had been used without consent. Institutions froze accounts or opened reviews and added their own reports to the file. My name stayed printed on everything, but for the first time the systems behind those lines treated me as someone wronged, not as the person who had created the mess. Law enforcement came in through a bank whose fraud policy left little room to ignore what we had shown. Once the file reached their compliance team, the situation stopped being a family problem and became a case number. An investigator asked where I had lived, who had access to my documents, and how long the pattern had gone unnoticed. I was no longer telling a story. I was confirming facts. My sister hired an attorney and cut off direct contact. Through my parents, I heard how she framed what she had done. She called it protection, said she had kept my life stable on paper while I worked overseas, claimed she believed I would be grateful once I understood. The man from the house gave his own statement, explaining how he had trusted the paperwork and believed he was sharing a home with the person whose passport and records matched my name. None of their explanations changed the signatures on the forms or the debts tied to my Social Security number. The legal process moved slowly but steadily. Hearings decided which accounts could be reversed, which debts would follow my sister instead of me, and which contracts had to be dismantled or rewritten. Some companies cooperated, wiping balances and correcting files. Others resisted until Nina pushed harder. Once findings became official, my sister's employer reevaluated her position. A role built on judgment and discretion could not stay untouched by an investigation involving forged signatures and misrepresented records. My parents tried to stand between us. They asked if I could ease up on certain claims, if there were accounts I could afford to leave alone, if there was a way to handle everything quietly. I listened and repeated the same answer. I would correct what had been done in my name. I would follow the legal process. I would not bend facts to make anyone more comfortable. I left the motel and moved into a small apartment in another part of the state. The lease carried only my information, and the keys in my hand were the only set. Ian helped set fraud alerts. Nina kept a folder ready for anything new. I also obtained a no-contact order that covered more than phone calls or messages. My sister could not come to my home, could not appear at my workplace, and could not send other people in her place. When she tested that boundary once, the response went back through attorneys instead of family, and the order stayed where it was. After that, the distance stopped being emotional and became structural. My relationship with my parents did not disappear, but it changed. When they asked about their other daughter, I told them to ask her. When they asked about shared holidays, I said I would not sit at the same table with her again. The house tied to my stolen identity was sold as part of unwinding the fraud. I did not walk through it before it changed hands. I signed what I needed to sign and let it become someone else's address. I could have held on to anger and replayed every early warning I ignored. I could have turned the whole mess into a bitter anecdote I told as proof that you cannot trust anyone. Neither felt like a way to move forward. Anger might have been honest, but it would have kept me standing in the shadow of a life I never chose. What I came back to was this: family does not cancel accountability. Trust without boundaries is not loyalty. It is a gap someone else can step into and claim. Documentation is not just paperwork. It is a way to anchor reality when the people around you are willing to distort it. If this story offers you anything, let it be permission to treat your own name as something worth guarding. Pay attention to small inconsistencies. Ask questions when details do not line up. And if you ever realize that someone has been using your identity as a costume, remember that you are allowed to step out of the role they wrote for you and insist on your own. Thank you for staying with me through this. If it made you pause or rethink how you protect yourself, I hope you will share it with someone who might need the warning just as much as you did.